And we are going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We are here for the first and only OAR book talk of the fall 2021 semester, featuring Isabel Martinez and her book, Becoming Transnational Youth Workers, that I have just included a link to in the chat. It is published by Rutgers University Press. And Isabel is joined today by the chair of our Latin American and Latinx Studies Department, Jose Luis Morin, and by discussant Daysi Diaz-Strong. Dr. Morin will be introducing Dr. Martinez, and Dr. Martinez will in turn introduce Dr. Diaz-Strong. And with that, I will hand the floor over to Jose Luis. Thanks so much, Jose.
Thank you, Dr. Stageman. Appreciate it. And thank you, the Office of the Advancement of Research at John Jay College for helping to put on this event this evening. I'm Professor Jose Luis Morin, Chair of the Latin American and Latinx Studies Department at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And I want to wish you all a good evening and thank you for joining us. This evening's event features Dr. Isabel Martinez, who will talk about her book, Becoming Transnational Youth Workers, Independent Mexican Teenage Migrants and Pathways of Survival and Social Mobility, an important work that examines the experiences and realities of unaccompanied Mexican teenage minors in New York City. It's especially important for us to be here tonight at John Jay, or at least virtually at John Jay, because John Jay is a Hispanic serving institution with a sizable population of Latinx and immigrant students. And this is a very important topic for our students and our community here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Joining Dr. Martinez tonight as a discussant is Dr. Daysi Diaz-Strong from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Our second discussant, who was scheduled to be with us this evening, Dr. Stephanie Canizales from the University of California at Merced, unfortunately has taken ill and will not be able to join us. But to start us off, I'd like to say a few words about Dr. Isabel Martinez. Dr. Isabel Martinez is an associate professor in the Department of Latin American and Latinx Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the director of ULAMP at John Jay College. It's ULAMP representing the Unaccompanied Latin American Minors Project, a research and service project that has placed over 75 undergraduate Latinx students in various New York City-based immigration agencies to provide academic, social, and legal support to recently arrived immigrant minors in removal proceedings. Dr. Martinez is a recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Woodrow Wilson National Foundation Fellowship, the 2018 New York State Youth Leadership Council Outstanding Educator Award, the 2018 John Jay Distinguished Service to Students Award, the 2015 Cuando Kinshasa Excellence in Mentoring Award, and the 2012 John Jay Distinguished Teaching Award. Published in journals and edited volumes on both sides of the US-Mexican border, our research has focused on Mexican and Central American youth migration, Latinx youth and higher education, and the use of technology in Hispanic serving institutions and Latinx studies classrooms. Her manuscript, Becoming Transnational Youth Workers, was published by Rutgers University Press in 2019 and lauded for, quote, helping us to see those who are invisible among us, independent teenage Mexican minors. The daughter of an independent Mexican teenage minor herself, Martinez sheds light on the under-discussed immigrant population to help us understand how decades of binational and transnational policies and practices have continued to propel contemporary Mexican teenage minors to leave their parents behind and seek survival in the United States. Dr. Daysi Diaz-Strong is an assistant professor at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She received her PhD and MSW from the Crown Family School of Social Work, Practice, and Policy at the University of Chicago. She also holds an MA in Educational Leadership from Northeastern Illinois University. Dr. Diaz-Strong immigrated to the United States from Ecuador at the age of 9 and was undocumented until her late 20s. Her immigrant background shaped her professional and research interests in education and immigration. For various years, she worked in the community college system, developing and implementing programs to improve the success of underrepresented students. Her research agenda focuses on the educational and developmental trajectories of Latinx undocumented immigrants. She has published various articles and book chapters on college experiences of undocumented students. Most recently, Dr. Diaz-Strong has examined the pathways to adulthood in Mexican and Central American undocumented youth adults who immigrated as adolescents, or the 1.25 generation. Our event will start off with Dr. Martinez. Dr. Diaz-Strong will then share her thoughts, and the discussion between the two will then follow. We will leave some questions at the end for some time at the end for questions. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Martinez for her to say a few words about her wonderful book and to begin our discussion this evening. Dr. Martinez.
Great, thank you so much, Jose Luis, for the wonderful introduction, and a special thank you to everyone who's logged on for this talk. I want to give special thanks to our special guest tonight, Dr. Daysi Diaz-Strong, who, as you heard, is an impressive scholar who also deeply engages in research with and focusing on unaccompanied minors from Mexico and Central America. Her work inspires me, and I'm thrilled that she said yes to being here tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Diaz-Strong. And do please check out her publications in the chat as well. Unfortunately, our other scheduled guest, Dr. Stephanie Canizales, also a rising star scholar on unaccompanied minors in California, fell ill and couldn't make it this afternoon, but we wish her a speedy recovery and hope that we can host her back at John Jay really soon. Her research is spectacular. I want to also give special thanks to the folks who helped put tonight's book talk together, namely Dan Stageman and the Office for the Advancement of Research. Thank you for selecting this book for this talk and for demonstrating patience and persistence after our delays last year. Many, many thanks. I also want to thank those who made this book possible in the logistical sense, including the Now Institute for Citizens and Scholars, who afforded me the time to write, as well as the John Jay Office of Advancement of Research, who helped fund this book's completion. This book was born out of my dissertation, so I'd be remiss not to thank the Spencer Foundation, Society for the Study of Social Problems, Teachers College, Columbia University, as well as wonderful professor at the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, Gloria Moroni, for also supporting especially the first phase of this research. I, of course, want to thank my press, Rutgers University Press, and my editors, Leslie Michener and then Nicole Solano, as well as Rutgers University press staff, who helped in all capacities to bring this book to light. And lastly, and I'm going to go ahead and just show this real quick. I want to thank the artist. There we go. There's the cover of my book. Acknowledge the artist who created the cover for my book, Maria Jose Delgado, who is actually one of my former students, who was in Adelante, and also ULamper. And as you can see from the cover, a really gifted artist. Books are written with much moral support, and I had no shortage of folks who, lucky for me, were enthusiastic to see this come to light, including my colleagues in the Department of Latin American Latinx Studies, as well as in other spaces in gender studies and sociology, my students, many friends, and my family, and especially my partner. Lastly, of course, I thank all of the young Mexican youth and their families, both in Puebla and here in New York City, who welcomed me into their homes, fed me at their kitchen tables, and trusted me enough to share their stories with me. Okay, so for tonight's talk, I'm going to speak a little bit about the book, including why I wrote the book, how I conducted the research, and what my main findings were, or what I learned. I'll then turn to Dr. Daysi Diaz-Strong, who's graciously agreed to discuss my book, but also her own work with unaccompanied minors, and we're in a real treat with that. I want to note quickly that I may interchange the term into independent Mexican teenage migrants with unaccompanied minors in this talk. My colega also uses the term unaccompanied 1.25 generation immigrants. But in this book, I'm specifically speaking about Mexican youths who arrived in New York City without their parents and were not arriving to reunite with them prior to their 18th birthdays. So I like to, when I give book talks and talk about this book, I like to start with saying that this book was actually 100 years in the making. As I detail in the first pages of the manuscript, my own grandmother inspired me to pursue this line of inquiry. As documented by my uncle in a slim Kinko's bound book that he created for a family reunion, my grandmother never attended formal schooling and was married to my grandfather just shy of her 13th birthday. 2 years later, she would give birth to her first child. By the time she was 16, she and her husband would fear the impending violence brought on by the Mexican Revolution, and wrapping her infant daughter in a rebozo or a scarf, she would kiss her parents in El Molino, Guanajuato, Mexico, goodbye. Joined by her husband, her 11-year-old brother, and another family, she would travel 400 miles in 2 months to reach the US-Mexico border. At the time, the border was not militarized as it is today. She and her family did not have to pay thousands of dollars to cross. They were not forced to cross in dangerous areas, nor did she run the risk of being placed in a cage. She was also not forced to wait in dangerous Mexican border city tent camps where she would be vulnerable to sexual assault, kidnapping, extortion, or worse. They did not encounter prevention through deterrence policies or the Title 42 policy that characterized crossing today. And although they did have to evade Mexican federalistas or the soldiers and villistas, and when they crossed over into Texas, the rinches or Texas Rangers, in many ways, it was a simpler time. Nearly 100 years later, I found myself far from where she crossed in New York City in a doctoral program tasked with writing a paper for the Sociology of the Life course class. To complete the paper, I was to interview someone and apply some of the elements of life course theory, or a theory whose concepts help to explain why and how people live out their lives, especially in relation to social, cultural, and historical contexts. Most of the literature that I had been assigned up to that point drew conclusions from samples of individuals who were white and upper middle class and reflected the life courses we have come to uphold as desirable or acceptable or normal in the United States. Being in school until ages 18 or later, not working until mid-teenage years, if even then, and living with and financially depending on parents until age 18 or later. Discussions of out-of-school child laborers, both immigrant and non-immigrant in the United States, according to this literature, was something of the past, as demonstrated in one of my assigned texts at the time, Glenn H. Elder's seminal work, Children of the Great Depression. At the time, however, I was also an ESL instructor in the basement of a Catholic church located just off of Fordham Road in the Bronx, and I had several students who were Mexican young adult males. Over time, I learned much about their lives, their families, and their living conditions in New York City, and I knew that their life courses did not reflect the theories I was learning about. I also knew that there were even younger Mexican youths in the city who did not fit these theories. I would see them late at night on the subway as I traveled home from the library around 11 p.m. I would see who I thought were baby-faced teenage boys on the trains alone. I myself, having been socialized into accepting a life course that reflects experiences of upper class white youth as, again, normal, had an initial reaction of questioning the appropriateness of their presence on the trains alone late at night. I would see the youths again serving me water in restaurants, stocking cans in bodegas, selling flowers in flower shops, and flipping burgers behind the large glass counters in delis. So when the opportunity came to write a paper testing sociology of life course theories, I decided that I wanted to learn more about these youth who, I would soon find, were part of a phenomenon of children and teenagers leaving Mexico. And in the case of youths who I was seeing, were out of school and working and living in New York City without their parents. And here I have a clipping from a newspaper that ran here in New York, El Diario de México, Nueva York, from 2012 that was announcing Poblanitos se juegan la vida, 10 chavitos migran al día, which basically translates into that people from Puebla, or little children from Puebla, were playing with their lives, that 10 of them were migrating from Puebla each day, and talking about the increase of immigration at these ages from Puebla. When I shared this assignment with my ESL students, one offered that one of his friend's nephews would be just a teenager to speak with. Having arrived from Tecomatlan, Puebla, just 9 months prior, Armando would become the teen who first provided me a firsthand account of this phenomenon of teenagers leaving their families behind and immigrating to send remittances back home. By the end of my study that spanned between 2006 and 2009, and then again from 2013 to 2015, I would engage in participant observations in 2 communities in Puebla, Mexico, and conduct 81 interviews across Puebla and New York City. These participant observations and interviews helped me to learn more about the ways in which youth challenge social reproduction and mainstream models of the life course by enacting their agency at young ages, by living their lives transnationally, by negotiating traditional and modern, but also classed social constructions of adolescence and adulthood, including beginning their transitions to adulthood at earlier ages. As a sociologist, I was particularly interested in how these youth got these ideas, or how these youth realized and adopted ideas and practices about family, immigration, schooling, work, and age, how this occurred in dialogue with structures and social institutions with which they engaged, namely their families, schools, and the labor market in and across Mexico and New York City, and how these ideas became, quote, natural or common sense to them. Theoretically, I wanted to put a transnational life course spin on social reproduction theory, or see how Mexican teens understood avoiding their parents' class positions and engaged in what the youth would call getting ahead, a euphemism for social class mobility, by participating in a transnational space and immigrating without their parents at their young ages to New York City. Within this, I was also challenging mainstream notions of adolescence and adulthood, arguing that these youths were engaging in both at early ages and arguably at the same time. So, although they evolved over time, oops, let's see here. There we go. This book was guided by the following research questions. And when I started my dissertation, I actually was interested more in the schooling aspect of it, in terms of why did some Mexican teenage migrants drop into school while others didn't, and that original population included 15 youths who actually made it into traditional schooling and traditional high schooling. So that was the first research question I started out with. But as I began to do interviews and began to understand that this was a broader issue, the research question evolved to why and how do some Mexican teenage migrants immigrate without their parents, and why and how do some Mexican teenage migrants challenge mainstream life course and US age norms. And the second question arose when I found out that the ones who were in school, traditional schooling, were here with their parents, and the ones who weren't were here without their parents. So I asked a lot of questions to find out the answers to these questions. And overall, these are what I consider the main findings. Independent Mexican teenage migrants are caught between modernization policies. The Mexican teenage immigrants who I interviewed were growing up caught in between modernization policies in and across Mexico and New York City that both deny and are meant to extend childhood in Mexico. On the one hand, NAFTA was supposed to improve their Mexican communities and households' economic conditions, but it didn't, and actually led to increased incorporation of women and children into wage labor, as well as immigration to new contexts of reception like New York City. This occurred while policies meant to expand children's rights, as well as their dependence up to older ages, were being passed. For example, in Mexico, such policies included educational reforms, extending mandatory schooling to, at that time, the end of junior high school, around the age of 14 and 15. And since then, compulsory schooling has been extended beyond that. Youths under the age of 14 could not work at all, and up until age 16, youth could not work without their parents' permission. That too, since the time of my research, has extended to age 15 in terms of not being able to work at all. No one under the age of 18 cannot work without proof of secundaria or junior high school completion. 2, because of their class positions, but most of the youth who I interviewed fell on the denial side of the pendulum in terms of denials of childhood and adolescence, and experienced truncated childhood where they entered into work and left their schools and homes early. Most of the independent Mexican teenagers who I interviewed were from states and communities that were disproportionately impacted by NAFTA and grew up in poor rural households where they could not enjoy extended dependence on their parents. So for just to give some backgrounds, the majority of the youth who I interviewed were from Pueblo, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. And the poverty rates in these states are 64%, 61%, and 69% respectively. In addition to growing up in poor households that necessitated their labor and wage contributions, most of the independent Mexican teenage migrants were growing up in contexts where, due largely to poverty, the social institutions that help shape their habituses, a concept of social reproduction, or their ideas and orientations about age and class norms, which social institutions they should engage in or not engage in with at certain ages. These social institutions enforced and supported policies and practices that enabled or demanded certain behaviors and actions from the youths and their families that are considered early in the US. So again, whereas being out of school at age 15 may be deemed acceptable in Mexico, it's not at the US. And this is something that we call, again, when we start comparing systems, like schooling systems or labor markets, et cetera, we call these asynchronous fields. And again, sort of just to give an idea about dropout rates, in Pueblo, Oaxaca, and Guerrero, where most of the youth were from, the dropout rates hovered around 50% in those states. They immigrate to honor familism at young ages. So independent Mexican teenage migrants also learn to pull their families, but also themselves ahead and see immigration as a way to do so. Drawing heavily from familism, the youth expressed obligations to their grandparents, parents, and siblings in Mexico and wanted to help support them. They would learn that these obligations were a form of ayuda mutua, or interdependence at early ages, that their, as well as other family members' labors and wages were needed to maintain the family's nourishment and survival. And this is actually encoded in law. I talk a little bit about this in the book. But simultaneously and over time, youth also reported wanting lives better for themselves, whether it be in the form of building their own homes or setting up their own businesses back in Mexico. The youth are planful choice makers, not luggage. In the midst of this, however, Mexican immigrant youth are planful choice makers who, starting at early ages and within structural constraints, strategize or engage in particular actions in relation to age-graded dispositions, the capital, which is information or resources they possess, and the social institutions that they encounter, the school, labor market, immigration, and households. One can see the youths making decisions about staying in or dropping out of school in Mexico, dropping into or staying out of school in New York City, as well as about immigrating without their parents and seeking, accepting, and changing jobs, both in Mexico and in New York City. And this is a deviation from when I started doing this research. The characterization of immigrant youth was largely, they were largely described as luggage who would follow their parents, follow adults to wherever they were immigrating. And so this was a deviation from that, and seeing that the youth that I was speaking with were not following necessarily, but actually making decisions for themselves. Their planful choice making, however, is facilitated by their membership in transnational social networks that included older peers and family members who act as agents or folks who can model certain behaviors to the youths, including immigration and remittance sending, but also with whom the youths can exchange social capital, usually in the form of information about immigration, family, jobs, etc. By participating in these social networks while they are still in Mexico, youths then begin to envision a broader transnational social field in which they are members. For example, perhaps prior to learning and receiving information about jobs in New York City, the youths only know about the jobs in their communities. But as they begin to learn about el otro lado from older relatives and peers, they also learn about the types of jobs and wages that exist there, and they begin to envision themselves entering them. Once in New York City, again, these social networks are essential as a youth seek employment and secure housing. They are less essential in regards to enrolling into traditional schooling. Additionally, the planful choice making includes the negotiation and renegotiation of their dependence, interdependence, independence, and autonomy, both economic and emotional within their households. These negotiations are age graded and shift across their life courses in space, first with their immediate households in Mexico and New York City, but also transnationally when they reside in both spaces, when they reside in either of the spaces. In Mexico and in New York City, Mexican teenage migrants face tenuous schooling situations that are characterized by obstacles to their success, including in Mexico, accessibility, both in terms of geography and cost. So for example, in Mexico, many of the communities that the youths were from may only have schools, at the time only had primarias or elementary schools and didn't have junior high school. So to go on to junior high school, they would have to incur costs, including travel, to continue their schooling. So that's in terms of geography. And also schools in Mexico have different fees, including for registration, something called cooperaciones to help maintain, also to help maintain the school, uniforms, et cetera, that also made attendance, especially for families that had multiple children, very difficult. In New York City, in spite of laws in New York City that make their attendance mandatory, New York City schools are not structured to accommodate working immigrants, especially those who work excessively. And in New York City, schooling is compulsory until the age of 17. Additionally, with plans to leave after a short period of time, youth have little interest in these types of traditional schooling. And if they are interested in schooling, they're interested in English language classes so they can ascend in their workplaces. Alternatively, they start working in their households and are pretty easily welcomed into the labor market and the wage labor market at early ages. In both Mexico and New York City, employers ignore child labor laws and hire these youths for their usefulness and exploitability. They are subject to abusive conditions, physical, verbal, sexual, and economic. But in the midst of this, the youths themselves exhibit agency and not only seek, but regularly change work conditions in search of better pay and better treatment. They also experience truncated childhoods and earlier transitions to adolescence, according to themselves, into what is traditionally accepted as markers of the transition to adulthood. So both they experience early transitions to adolescence and transitions to adulthood. The markers being leaving school and home, entering into the labor market, and then family formation. However, when asked to interpret which life course stages they are in, they were less sure of whether they were adolescents or young adults because they also applied subjective understandings to these categories and the role transitions they were engaging in. More than these markers themselves, and these markers are pretty prevalent in sociology literature, it was the decision-making, the responsibilities, the financial independence that had led them to New York City, as well as supporting their families by sending monies home each month that seemed to mark their identification with adulthood. In the same breath, though, they shared that because they lacked adult experiences, were not self-assured, still engaged in immature activities, and lacked the responsibilities associated with marriage and children. So perhaps they were adolescents. And I just want to add real quick, what's interesting too is in relationship to the transition, the markers of the transition adulthood, while the first three markers accelerated to achieve them or complete them, the last two that deal with family formation seem to be delayed in relation to their peers who had remained in Mexico. So at this point, I want to turn over the discussion to my colega, Dr. Diaz-Strong, who will elaborate on my book. I'm going to stop sharing, but also her own research with 1.25 generation unaccompanied minors.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this wonderful book, and to the John Jay College of Criminal Justice for hosting the event. So I'm actually recovering from a cold and just have this lingering cough that is worse when I talk. So I'm okay, but just please forgive me if I need to like cough or mute myself for a second. Hopefully I'll get through it. I have my water here. So I'm really looking forward to discussing your book. You know, this book has priority on my bookshelf. I go to it constantly. And I think it's because it so richly contextualizes the experiences of these independent, unaccompanied migrants. And it does so both in Mexico and then in the United States, and that process of learning to become independent migrants. If there was one complaint that I have, is that it was not out earlier. Because when I was engaging in my own thought process with this, a similar population, and then engaging in my dissertation research and writing the dissertation, the book was not out yet. So then when in 2019, the book came out, I just immediately gobbled it up. And I've really been using it in my writing and in my thinking and as a thought partner ever since. And I just, first just thank you for this intellectual gift that you have given to us. I want to really emphasize for the audience here just how groundbreaking this work is. Dr. Martinez, your fieldwork started in 2006. This was much before there was meaningful conversation about unaccompanied minors or those who immigrate as teenagers, whether it's in research or in the public spaces. These were not mainstream conversations at all. When there was more discussion around these issues was in 2014, when we saw a surge in unaccompanied minors from Central America. And so since then, we've had this focus and attention, both from the media, from research, from stakeholders that have focused on unaccompanied minors. But the focus has largely been on Central American unaccompanied minors who are fleeing violence. And of course, that's important. The experiences of Central Americans deserve that space. But we still haven't had a good conversation about those from Mexico. And I think, one of the reasons that they've been so invisible is that Mexican unaccompanied minors are treated differently than Central American unaccompanied minors. For Central American unaccompanied minors, there's some protections through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPRA, where if they're apprehended, they can stay in the United States. They're placed in child detention centers, reunited with family, and then they can stay in the United States as they proceed with their immigration case. And a determination is made whether they have access to legal protections. But with Mexican minors, if they're apprehended, they are returned to Mexico. So those who are in the United States who are unaccompanied have largely entered undetected. And so the sort of elaborate system that exists for unaccompanied minors, composed of detention centers, legal service providers, child advocates, those don't exist and haven't existed for Mexican minors in any of the same ways. And so because of that, I think we still haven't paid enough attention. And your book, Dr. Martinez, is such an important corrective to the invisibility of Mexican unaccompanied minors specifically. And I want to also note that Mexican child migrants, independent migrants, like none of this is new. They have been coming for decades. There's an incredible historian, if you're interested in this, Dr. Yvonne Padilla Rodriguez. She studies child migration in the 20th century. And she makes this argument that all across, the 1900s, the discussion of migration has been adult-centric. And yet what she has found through her review of archives is that children have always migrated, and they've migrated with families, but also many of them have migrated without families. And they've done so for some of the same reasons that my work shows and Dr. Martinez's work shows. They're migrating to work. They're migrating to reunite with family who might have come before them. Sometimes they're following a spouse. The women in particular might be following a spouse. And so there's this connection that is, coming from the 19th century through now. And I think, Dr. Martinez, your work is really contributing to giving us a more complete history of migration and child migration in particular. So what I want to do now is highlight a couple of the findings that I most connected with. And in doing that, share a little bit about my work, bring up some of the similarities, some of the differences, and then we can have some discussion. So just to share a little bit about my own work, for my dissertation work, I interviewed teenage arrivals. So I was looking at those who immigrated between the ages of 13 to 17. They were adults by the time that I spoke to them, but they were retrospectively sharing their experiences of immigrating as adolescents. Some of them were unaccompanied, some of them were not. I'm going to focus in on those who were unaccompanied, since that's, where our work overlaps the most. And my sort of focus became about kind of like the life course, like Dr. Martinez, and I was focused on what it was like to immigrate as an adolescent. So thinking developmentally, thinking about this period in the life course, what was it like to immigrate as an adolescent under the constraints of legal exclusion, where they were facing harsh immigration policies, and then having to make all sorts of decisions as adolescents en route to becoming adults and as they were taking on these adult roles. And this became an interest of mine. All my previous research had focused on those who immigrate in early and middle childhood. We tend to refer to them as the 1.5 generation. I'm a member of the 1.5 generation, and so that's kind of where my interest had gone. But then I interned at a detention center in Chicago. This detention center was for unaccompanied minors who had been apprehended. It was for boys between the ages of 14 to 17. And this experience in the detention center really shook what I thought I knew about immigrants who arrive in childhood. It was seeing something very different than the experiences of those who come in early and middle childhood. And that's what prompted me to ask the question of what it's like to immigrate as an adolescent. My work includes Central Americans, but it also includes Mexicans. One of the big ways that I think our work overlaps is the agency that we demonstrate in the migration process. I think, Dr. Martinez, do such a great job of navigating this tension between agency and structure. So, you tell us about choices that young people make. You tell us about how they're directing the lives that they want and that the goals that they're aiming for, and how they're taking steps to do that. At the same time, you show us how structure is involved, right? How there's limitations and constraints, and how they're pushed into these pathways that they end up taking. I love how you take us through the pre-migration decision and thought processes by interviewing youth who were considering migration. And then you take us through the US and how they contend with becoming independent migrants who are supporting their families. You talk about how they are acting on deeply rooted ideas learned in Mexico, ideas about family responsibility, interdependence, ayuda mutual or mutual help. You show how these adolescents are pursuing migration, often despite their parents' opposition, despite their parents feeling that they're too young to make the journey. And yet they engage in making the decision. They prepare to immigrate, and then they put that plan into action. Those stories resonated so much with my own participants' experiences. I also find that these migrants made plans to immigrate and then executed those plans, and often going against their parents. One, participant that I remember, a Guatemalan young man, his mother had just begged him not to go. She had cried and cried. She was so worried that he was going to perish on the journey. But he was determined. He knew he was taking a risk, but he felt that he had to take the risk for his family so that he could provide for them. And so to avoid his mother stopping him, he snuck out in the middle of the night in order to leave to migrate. And so again, this agency is so present, but you also situate what influences those choices, right? So you demonstrate how these ideas that they learn are shaped by policies in Mexico, as well as in the US. I particularly like the chapter Pushed or Jumped, where you document, probably because I'm also an educator, but because you document the failures of educational policy in Mexico, particularly in rural communities. These policies that, as you just said, extend protection, but deny access to education. And so they find it incredibly difficult to continue schooling with these limited opportunities. You state that they not so accidentally are being primed to become transnational workers. And so even though there's agency and there's choice and subjectively they experience it that way, these ideas of leaving school and eventually migrating are also a result of the lack of access to educational institutions and the lack of support to continue schooling. So again, I think that you just model so beautifully how you can both center agency, but contextualize it and demonstrate the limits and the ways that societal structures push people towards certain life course paths. I want to talk a little bit about one of the differences that I saw in our work. I love the beginning of your book, and you also talked about it here, where you talk about your grandmother who left Mexico in 1918. You talk about how she married as a teenager. She cared for the children of her sister-in-law. She then had her own child, and then she immigrated at the age of 16. And there's 100 years difference here between your grandmother and now. But in my research, I have adolescent women whose stories are very similar to your grandmother. They might have been a little bit older when they had children or got married and migrated, but that experience of marrying and then migrating, or migrating as a teenager and then getting married, and then their lives being structured around caretaking of other people's children, of their family or their own children, was very present in my research. What I saw was that gender emerged as central. It was central to why they immigrated. It was central to the challenges that they confronted in the US once they arrived. So for the women, they did sometimes migrate for work, but other times they were fleeing gender violence, or they were getting married and following a spouse to the US. Even those who were migrating for work, once they arrived in the US, they had some kind of authority figure in their lives. Sometimes it was an older brother, sometimes it was an uncle, often it was a spouse. But in any case, they weren't as independent or as kind of able. They were not necessarily becoming and learning to be independent migrants, but learning how to adapt to somebody else's authority in their lives. The other aspect of this that was different is that they didn't necessarily engage in working these low-wage jobs where they're exploited. They did work here and there, but often what they were doing was unpaid care work. So they were cleaning and cooking, caring for their family's children. Sometimes they were becoming parents as teenagers and caring for their own children. But really importantly, these were not choices they felt they were making. They felt compelled to do this, right? They would have much preferred to work outside the home. Many of them would have loved to have enrolled in school, but they didn't feel that they had a choice, and they felt that they were being told by older male family members that they had to stay and take care of the family. So even as we talk about unaccompanied minors becoming independent, there's a nuance there where women struggle with attaining that independence. They're much more dependent financially, much more constrained in their decision making. The last part of the book that I'll mention, which you talked about here, and I'll talk a little bit more about, because there's so much overlap in our findings, which I love, right? I love that we completely did the separate and then we come up with such similar things. But that's the chapter where you discuss whether they felt adult or adolescent, and then why they felt adult or adolescent. And you ultimately show that there's a lot of ambivalence among your participants and whether or not they felt adult or adolescent. And this is despite the fact that they're engaging in roles that we associate with adulthood. So they're leaving the childhood home, they're entering full-time work, they are being financially responsible. They're making these big decisions like immigrating, enrolling or not enrolling in school, etc. And yet, despite all of that, they didn't necessarily claim adulthood. In some cases they did, in some cases they didn't. And I found something very similar. I was very interested in their subjective feeling of adulthood. And so I asked all my participants what age they were when they started to feel adult, and then why, what prompted them to feel adult. And in most cases, they did not connect adult roles to making them feel adult. Instead, there had to be time that passed. It had to be a learning process. So it wasn't when they started working. It wasn't when they became responsible for themselves and for others. It was after some time when they now felt that they had the ability, the capacity, the thoughtfulness to make good decisions, not just to make decisions, but to make good decisions. When not only did they have responsibility, but they felt they knew how to handle those responsibilities, right? They could make mature decisions from their perspective. And so every time they described to me, well, not every time, but a lot of the times when they described to me what made them feel adult, it was something related to when they finally realized they were mature and able to take on the responsibilities that they had taken on as teenagers. And so I think both of our work really problematizes the connection between roles and adulthood, and shows that becoming an adult is much more complex. So I'm going to end here and just put out some questions, take them as you want, so that, we can engage in some discussion here. So the first one is related to gender. I'm really curious to whether you saw any gender differences in your work, or, how the way, you went about your work might have prevented some of those differences from emerging. So, anything that you would like to say related to the gender differences. I'm also just curious about how you think about these independent migrants and their stage in the life course. So, you talk about in the book that you don't intend to conclude whether they're adolescents or adults, but you're interested in the life course. You're interested in, these normative views of life stages and how they're not following those normative views. And so I'm curious how you think we should think about what stage of the life course they're in, and what should we make of that, right? What does that mean then to those of us who want to support these young people? I have a couple methods questions.
Okay.
So one is, I would love it if you could talk about how you went about the recruiting process. I know, people don't read the appendix, but I did read it. And you talk about some of the challenges you faced in recruiting. And so for students, for others who are interested in hard to reach populations, you could share the challenges, how you overcame some of those challenges. And along with that, would you do anything differently, right? If you could restart your project all over again today, would there be anything that you would ask that would be different, any way that you would go about your research differently? What would matter now that maybe you didn't, consider back then? I'll stop there, but I have a couple other questions if needed.
So much stuff to talk about, and likewise, I feel like sort of the timing of our meeting, and I'll just share, I reached out to Daysi after seeing one of the articles that we are posting in the chat come out and getting super excited about it. And I knew that there are very few of us, I think, who are doing work on 1.25 unaccompanied minors. And so to find another kindred spirit is always exciting for me. And so it has been a real pleasure to be able to, prepare for this talk and then just hear your work. And again, all the little synapses are going off about, for researchers, this little tiny slice of research that we decide to commit ourselves to. really great questions. I'm not even sure where to begin, but I may start with the easiest question, which I think is the methods question, and then sort of jump around from there. So in terms of methods, I mean, like I said in the beginning, you know, this really started with a PhD paper, right? And so for my students who are here, I think I have some students here. Do not discount where one of your professor's assignments may lead you. In my case, it led me to a book and other really great things. And so, you know, what was important at the time was that I was, you know, and just to give this as background, I came to New York as a doctor to pursue doctoral studies because I was interested in what we would call new destination, or New York City being a new destination for Mexican migrants. And when I came, actually, I had a totally different idea about what research I was going to engage in. I wanted to work on issues around parents, actually, and their children's education. And then again, like I think I explained in the talk, you know, other forces take over. My grandmother took over. This class took over, and these youths who I was seeing took over. And so I went in a different direction. And so I was already getting embedded and making contacts in the Mexican community with different community organizations and human rights organizations. And so, like I said, I was already teaching, I think, through, I think this was who at the time, an organization here in Mexico, in New York City, Asociación Tepeyac, who has been really critical in terms of organizing Mexicans, helping Mexicans who were affected by 9/11, you know, recover or identify people who perished in 9/11, and a whole other sort of services that they provide. And so that really helped me get started in this work, in being able to reach out to these organizations who I was already establishing relationships with and tell them, you know, I am doing this work. I think it's really important, though, and I continue to this day, to give before taking, what we call research taking, or to do work in the communities before actually conducting research on or with them. And so I spent several years doing that before starting. And so after that first initial paper, I think I went to Mexico. And this is, I mean, I love her to this day. I feel I reached out to a scholar in Puebla who was doing work on Poblano migration to New York City. She didn't know me, she'd never met me, and was really just going based off of an email I sent her. I would like to come, this is what I'm working on, could you help me? And fortunately for me, she said yes. And she's been a friend since, and she's wonderful. So I was really just put into this context from the get-go in 2006, and spent several months in Puebla. She had done work in 2 communities in Puebla, so she introduced me, which is very important research, to these communities, and introduced me to families who held significant roles and were respected in the communities. And then these families, you know, took me around, her graduate students took me around to meet other people. And that's really how that first phase of the research started in these 2 communities. And, you know, I think one of the questions Ana Stephanie asked, what surprised me was, that people talk to me, right? I mean, I think as a researcher, I'm surprised that people will actually answer your questions. And here I was, a stranger in their community. And, you know, this is also an issue in doing this, in doing field work, nosy, really tall Mexican, like 3rd generation Mexicana, right? Chicana, who they never met, but here, you know, especially the students, I think, and the teachers were interested and curious about, why I was interested in speaking with them, but they were also curious about New York City because they had heard so much about New York City, especially the kids, the teens, and they had questions for me as well, if it was really like everyone had described it. And so, you know, it was this exchange of information, I think, with the youth. And so, but it was really doing this field work both in Mexico, and I can talk about when I got to New York, was really like person by person. It was, I was invited in the communities to speak to some classes, one in one community in the secundaria, the junior high school, and I did a whole presentation to the class. The teacher, one of the teachers had been to New York City and had returned. And when I asked to speak to this class, he thought it was a good, I think, lesson to also, an opportunity to also ask me questions in front of the kids, the youth, the students that would deter them from going, right? And so, and in the high school, similarly, I think they used my presentation as a way to try to convince the students not to leave. But after, I got students to sign up, and then I would just go from house to house, knocking on the door, or, going to where they were and see if they would talk to me. And it was difficult. Like this was very difficult there. Youth, like I describe in the book, they're already working. And so also to schedule time when they could sit down and speak with me was also difficult. I talk about, I don't think I talk about in the book, but I talk about another article, sort of challenges in being a woman who is alone also in the field, especially around in contexts where there are more traditional gender norms. And I was, we talked about this, and we can talk about it more. I was sexually harassed, I was threatened. And so sort of also navigating those gender norms in these communities, again, that I was an outsider to. And I think too, I'm just going to mention real quick, in doing this research, there was a certain level of naivete, I think, that, yeah, I could just go into these communities and ask these really personal questions. And I, again, with experience, learned more about how to navigate that. In New York City, I am exaggerating and not exaggerating in saying that these youths at the time, these teenagers were everywhere. I mean, I felt like they were. Maybe it was because of, my lens and I was seeking them, but our New York City economy, like many global cities, is dependent on undocumented labor, right? And so, and this is going to get to your gender question. Most of my sample were males, and so I would see them invisible. I would say invisible spaces, right? So, like I said, they were pouring water in a restaurant. They were stacking bodega cans. They were delivery boys. And so they were accessible in that sense. And that I think they were in very public-ish jobs. Whereas women, so getting to your gender question, I don't have a lot of women in my sample. I forgot to look up how many, but it was really a handful. Were doing the caretaking and in invisible, jobs behind closed doors, kept behind closed doors. And so because my recruiting was so public, or I guess I recruited in such a public way, I did not have access to them. One of the women who sticks out to me, and I think I shared the story with you, who actually, she's in the book, she actually was able to, she was a nanny. She made it to one of our comprehensive night schools here, Manhattan Comprehensive High School, that has classes in the morning and the afternoon. And then she found her way to Queens College and then Baruch, part of our CUNY system, and then followed a guy to Italy. And now she's a flight attendant. I was introduced to her by one of my friend's graduate assistants from Puebla who knew her family there, and then connected me to her here in New York City. So one of the things, and I'm jumping around, but one of the things I would have done differently would have relied more on the contacts I had made in Puebla, the families I had become friends with, to have them connect me to family here. But a lot of the kids actually, and the families in those communities, were also going not only to New York, but to communities in New Jersey. And so that, communities have particular pathways. And so it would have been more difficult for me to do that research. But that's one of the things I would have done differently. I think relied more and kept more in contact with the families and the youths who I met in Puebla. Okay, what else? Okay, I have, what life course are they in, right? Is that one of the things? And what would I do differently? Also, okay, so I feel like the life course question is the hardest question. So let me add to what else I would have done differently. And we talked about this too. And again, this goes back to positionality of the researcher, being a woman. You know, in this life course literature, and especially in the transitions to adulthood literature, is the issue of family formation, right? And getting a wife, getting a partner, and starting a family. And so, and also part of literature on adolescence has to do with sexual initiation and maturation. That is something I could not ask about, or I felt like I could not ask about as a woman. It would be, especially because most of my participants were male, it was and could be misconstrued. For me, it was just uncomfortable. At the end of the day, I am, formerly Catholic, right, Mexicana, but Chicana. And so it was very difficult. I think initially I had a couple of questions about that, and just the discomfort on both ends had me drop it. I think I would, as a more experienced, seasoned researcher now, go back and figure out how to ask those questions, because I think they are important. So that's just one. I think that's another thing that I really would have done differently. The other piece is I don't really, I don't pay attention to enough, and didn't include or seek out in my sample Indigenous Mexicans. And so I would want to figure out how to include them in this study, right? And I think that would just other sort of calculations would have to go into effect to do that. The life course question. Both, right? I think they're both. And in terms of moving forward and speaking with policymakers or educators and practitioners about how to support them, I think, I remember at the very beginning of the study, folks would say, but you want them to go to high school, right? Like you want these kids to go to traditional high school and have like a, apple pie kind of, American, quote unquote, American experience. I'm like, well, first of all, they can't. Second of all, they want to work and support their families and send money home. They aren't necessarily, like I said before, they're not necessarily interested in traditional schooling at this point. Some did become interested, and it really was by chance who they interacted with. And so I think we need to think about, expanding and funding, and this is an issue in New York City, English as a second language courses and attract the courses. Okay, 10 minutes remaining. I will stop here. To, get kids into quality ESL courses and give them the schooling that they want. In addition to that, think about child labor laws and, provide some sort of protected way for youths to work at least legal wages, right, and not be exploited. I think that's incredibly important to think about too. But and also I talk a lot about back in Mexico what needs to be done, right? A lot of, I think, what needs to happen is in the it's sort of continued, right? They've extended compulsory schooling. It's arguable about now. I think some of the issues that are pushing us youth to migrate have to do with violence and climate change, and we can talk about that. But social institutions in Mexico need to also be strengthened. Okay, we have 10 minutes. Sorry about that. I don't know if that answers, but a lot of stuff.
No, thank you. That's I agree with the both thing with the adolescence and adulthood. It's like this in-betweenness that is present. It's a different type of in-betweenness than other groups go through, because they're in between doing these adult roles, but still needing supports, right? So how do we support them even as you know, they need to engage in these roles. I think you have a couple questions in the chat.
Okay. Okay. So hi, Dr. Montelongo from UTEP. So are my interviewees still in New York, and do you continue to see migration patterns between Pueblo and New York City? So that's a difficult question to answer, in the sense that, and we talked about this too, I think, Daisy, about, or maybe with Stephanie, about IRB sort of making it really difficult for us to keep any information if we needed to contact them again. I think, you know, wink, wink, there are ways we've been able to stay in contact with the youth, and some, in my case, because several of them I recruited, I mean, from workplaces or through community-based organizations. I knew that if I went back to those workplaces, you know, they would be there. There was one youth who I'd interviewed who worked at a flower shop, and I would just, you know, continue to see him at the flower shop and drop by and have conversations with him. Another youth worked for a street vendor and lived with the street vendor. And I'm friends with the street vendor. So I knew that even if and this street vendor actually turned out to be the person who was connecting me to several of the youths. And so even if I didn't find the youth themselves, I could go to the street vendor and he could always update me. And actually he was the one who updated me about the departure of one of them, even though this youth had told me for years that he wanted to leave and he wanted to leave, he'd never left. And then one day, you know, I went by the florist and he wasn't there, and then went to his friend and he told me that he had returned. So it's, not all of them. I mean, there are a couple who are still in New York City. I don't know about the rest. And so, but I do keep in touch with some of them. Migration patterns between Puebla and New York City. It seems like the state that in recent years has increased its migration to New York City, and I don't know the percentages now in the city, has been Guerrero. And Guerrero has been, Tierra Caliente has been a site of a lot of violence. And some of the kids have also talked about that in terms of being reasons for arriving. And so I'm not sure. I know overall that migration patterns for unaccompanied minors from Mexico dipped for a couple of years, and this is going off of data from Customs CBP in terms of apprehensions. It dipped for a couple of years, but then has increased in the last 2 years. But I'm not sure what states and where they're actually going. Okay. Professor Perez, can you speculate the sense which phenomenon is uniquely or even primarily among migrants in New York City? Oh, yeah, I mean, so the question is, can I speculate on the extent to which the phenomenon of independent teenage migrants is uniquely or even primarily a Mexican phenomenon among migrants in New York City? Can it be observed in significant numbers among, say, Honduran, Salvadoran, Ecuadorian migrants to the city? It seems that the context of departure and reception that you identify could apply to other nationalities. Yeah, absolutely. Through my work with ULAMP and Safe Passage Project, and shout out to a couple of the staff there, I think, who are on this call. We definitely see migration from the countries that you just named. I think, although there's, when I've looked at the data, I'm trying to think now in terms of where they're going, it seems like Long Island has been a destination for more of these youth than actually the boroughs of New York City. And so my study focused on the boroughs of New York City, and it seems like these youths are going more out to Long Island and in other places. And I can get you more detailed information about that, Lisandro, in terms of, at least from what I know through the work that I do with Safe Passage Project. Oh, okay, good. Lenny Benson. Hi, Lenny. She's founder of Safe Passage Project, is an amazing lawyer who has committed her life to defending or helping immigrant youth attain citizenship in the New York City area. And she said around 50% of the youth in removal proceedings live in Long Island. And Lenny, that's a mostly Central American population. Yes, I'm gonna say yes, just because I saw some data recently. Okay. We have 3 minutes. I think that's it. One's a congratulations. So thank you, Dr. Bonino.
Isabel, I have one question for you. If we have 3 minutes, might as well ask it, eh?
Sure.
I have some limited knowledge of life course theory, and I know that, there's this idea of generativity, which is essentially about, depending on the theorist, it's about sort of positive resolution of various phases in the life course and the trials that you go through in the life course. And there's also an element of sort of giving back to that. And I'm curious about whether you got a sense from your respondents of their, I guess I would call it political awakening, or their consciousness of their own exploitation. Is that a different experience or a different course for youth migrants than it might be for adult migrants?
It's an interesting question. I think, I think it depends on their consciousness has a lot to do with who and what they're in contact with, right? And so, I feel like a couple directions we could go here. They, like a lot of other Mexican migrants or Latin American migrants, they are consumers of Univision, right? Telemundo. So the messages around the exploitation of immigrants, they're receiving them through television. The youths who maybe were 2 degrees of separation from folks who were involved with the community. So the youth who I interviewed were not themselves involved in the community-based organizations that I was working with, but they lived with members of these organizations. And so the members of the organizations would share information with them to heighten their awareness about these issues. So those youths also seem to be aware. How does that translate? I don't know if it's related to these ways that they know they're being they know that they're working in abusive conditions. And so regardless of what they've been exposed to, and the way that they address that though is, and I talk about in the book, sort of this idea of job turnover. They go and they look for other jobs, right? They are moving. There's a high level of job turnover among my respondents in that they were constantly looking for better conditions, better wages, where they would feel safer in some places, right? And so, they have the awareness that they deserve better. They don't deserve to be abused in these ways, but in terms of exploited in that, their wages are not the legal wages. They're aware of that, but they also understand that they're not going to be able to earn that amount. But it doesn't stop them from continuing to seek higher wages in other places and better conditions. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thanks, Isabel. We are about out of time. Jose, I see you've rejoined. Did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I just basically wanted to thank Dr. Martinez for her wonderful presentation, her wonderful book. It's just going to be continuing to make important contributions to the field. And of course, to thank Dr. Diaz-Strong for joining us this evening. It's been really important to hear your voice and to see how your contributions to this field and to this particular area are going to be something that we should be looking out for. So thank you for your work. I think this is really an important issue that will be with us well into the future. So thank you both.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Isabel, Daysi, Jose, for joining us today and for reminding us what amazing scholars we have at John Jay and what amazing scholars we're able to attract to contribute to our events. And as I said, this is our only OAR book talk for this fall, but we will have a full suite of 3 book talks in the spring, and we're looking forward to hosting you all again in the spring. Thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you so much, Daysi and Professor Morin. Thanks so much for doing this. Daysi especially, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.